Chapter 3: The Rebels Drink. By the time coffee crossed into Europe, rulers already had a century of hard-earned experience with it. They knew exactly what happens when people gather around a pot of coffee. Sultans had tried burning it, banning it. In the most extreme case, they sewed violators into leather sacks and dropped them into the Bosphorus. None of it had worked. Coffee kept spreading. Everywhere it went, it dragged the same troublesome side effect along with it. It made people want to sit together and talk. England was about to learn this lesson for itself. London's penny universities. London's first coffeehouse opened in the 1650s. Within a generation, the city had fallen for coffee almost as completely as Constantinople had a century earlier. By the 1670s, contemporary estimates placed the number of coffeehouses in London somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. That's an almost unbelievable density for a single city. Even the more conservative figure of 2,000 makes clear just how thoroughly the drink had taken over daily life. What made these places so explosive wasn't the coffee itself. It was the price of admission. For a single penny, anyone could walk in: a merchant, a clerk, a nobleman, a student, a journalist. They could take a seat and join whatever conversation happened to be underway. The entrance fee covered your cup. But it also covered something far more valuable: access to newspapers, pamphlets, and the latest gossip and arguments circulating through the city. It also bought you the company of total strangers, who by house custom were expected to be open and communicative rather than closed off and reserved. People began calling them penny universities. For the cost of a single coin, an uneducated man could sit for hours absorbing the wit, argument, and information of London's most engaged minds. One popular rhyme of the era put it plainly: there had never before been so great a university where a man could earn his education for the mere spending of a penny. Regular patrons had their favorite houses and their usual seats. Letters were addressed to men not at their homes but at their coffeehouse. Undercover to Addison at the St. James's Coffeehouse was a perfectly normal way to reach someone. Foreign visitors remarked that the coffeehouse, more than any palace or cathedral, was the single thing that most distinguished London from every other capital in Europe. One historian, looking back on the era, called it the Londoner's true home away from home. London's coffeehouses also quietly specialized, the way modern websites or forums cluster around a topic. Writers and poets gathered at Will's, where the poet Dryden held court. Later they gathered at Button's, where Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, the essayists behind the Tatler and the Spectator, traded ideas that filled their published pages. A lion's head letterbox at Button's, carved specifically for the purpose, let regulars drop off anonymous submissions and gossip for Addison's use. Merchants had their own preferred houses. Sailors had theirs, stock jobbers and underwriters had theirs. Each coffeehouse gradually became an informal headquarters for a particular trade or profession. One small custom born in these rooms has outlived every coffeehouse that ever practiced it: tipping. Brass-bound boxes often hung near the entrance of a coffeehouse. They were inscribed with the words, "to ensure promptness." This encouraged customers to drop in a coin if they wanted faster service from the staff. Historians believe the modern word tip comes directly from the initial letters of that phrase. It's a small linguistic fossil left behind by a habit that started in rooms full of people drinking coffee and arguing about politics. And exactly like Cairo, Mecca, and Constantinople before it, this popularity was precisely the problem as far as the government was concerned. The king who tried to ban coffee, and lasted 11 days. By 1675, England's coffeehouses had earned a nickname among nervous officials: seminaries of sedition. People of rank and influence gathered in them daily. They spoke with a freedom about the king's court and its policies that would have been unthinkable in almost any other public setting. King Charles II decided to try suppression himself. He was apparently unaware, or unbothered, that this exact strategy had already failed badly for the Ottoman sultans before him. In 1672 he'd already asked his senior judges to weigh in on whether he could legally shut the coffeehouses down. The judges were deeply divided. They eventually produced a mealy-mouthed opinion, vague enough to give the king cover. Essentially, they concluded that if coffeehouses functioned as gathering places for discussing state affairs and criticizing important people, they might reasonably be treated as public nuisances. It's hard not to notice the echo of Mecca's own coffee trial from a century and a half earlier. There too, physicians and judges under pressure from an unhappy governor produced similarly hedging, reluctant testimony against a drink most of them privately had no real objection to. On December 23, 1675, Charles finally issued a royal proclamation. It ordered every coffeehouse in England shut down by January 10 of the following year. The proclamation didn't mince words about its purpose. It declared that the great resort of idle and disaffected persons to these houses produced very evil and dangerous effects, including the spread of false, malicious and scandalous reports against the government. It threatened the disturbance of the peace and quiet of the realm. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Merchants who depended on the coffee, tea and chocolate trade pointed out how badly the ban would damage royal tax revenue. People of every political stripe complained bitterly about being cut off from their daily gathering places. The pressure built so quickly and so intensely that on January 8, 1676, a mere 11 days after the original proclamation, Charles was forced to issue a second proclamation quietly recalling the first. To save face, the reversal was dressed up as an act of royal generosity. It graciously permitted coffee retailers to remain open a while longer, as though the king had simply changed his mind out of kindness rather than been forced into retreat by public fury. It remains one of the shortest-lived bans in the entire history of government attempts to control what people drink and discuss. It's also one of the clearest illustrations of just how quickly people will mobilize to defend a habit that has become central to their social and civic life. From coffee cups to insurance empires. London's coffee houses didn't just host political arguments. They quietly became the birthplace of some of the largest financial institutions in the world, almost by accident. Around 1688, a man named Edward Lloyd opened a modest coffeehouse near the Thames. It catered to sailors, sea captains and merchants involved in shipping. As a simple convenience for his customers, Lloyd began compiling handwritten lists of ships and their cargo. This information was useful to the underwriters, the men willing to bet money on whether a given ship would complete its voyage safely, who gathered in his coffee room to discuss and strike these wagers. What began as a courtesy service in a coffeehouse eventually grew into Lloyd's of London. It's still today one of the most significant insurance and shipping intelligence institutions on the planet, tracking the movements of thousands of vessels across the globe. A cup of coffee, a few handwritten shipping lists and casual conversation among merchants had, over decades, hardened into a permanent pillar of global finance. Not far away, another coffeehouse called Jonathan's became the regular meeting place for stock jobbers, men who bought and sold shares in early joint stock companies. It eventually evolved into the institution that would become the London Stock Exchange. It's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. Two of the most powerful financial institutions in the modern world trace their direct origin not to a bank, a palace, or a government office. They trace it to men drinking coffee together and jotting down notes on the backs of napkins and ledgers. Paris, the cave of Procope. While London was busy turning coffee houses into universities and stock exchanges, Paris was turning them into something else entirely. They became literary salons that would eventually double as Revolutionary War rooms. The most famous of them all was the Café de Procope. It was opened by an Italian vendor named Francesco Procopio, who initially sold little more than lemonade, ices and spiced waters before adding coffee to his menu. He placed his café directly across from the newly built Comédie Française theater. The location proved irresistible to Paris's writers, actors and philosophers. Contemporaries described the place as dim and shadowy, often filled with gaunt, hollow-eyed poets who reportedly gave the interior an almost ghostly atmosphere. That's how it earned its nickname, the Cave of Procope. Voltaire became a fixture there for decades. His personal marble table and chair were preserved as treasured relics of the café long after his death. He was said to favor a drink that mixed coffee with chocolate. Rousseau debated philosophy at its tables. Diderot worked through ideas that would eventually fill the pages of his great encyclopedia. The dramatist Beaumarchais and the mathematician and revolutionary Condorcet, along with dozens of the era's leading writers and thinkers, all passed through its doors. A modest coffee shop turned into one of the most influential intellectual gathering points of the entire Enlightenment. Even Benjamin Franklin's name was regularly invoked at its tables. When news of his death reached Paris in 1790, the Café de Procope draped itself in black mourning bunting. Its patrons considered him a great champion of republican ideals. Where Marat, Robespierre, and a young Napoleon drank coffee. As the political temperature in France rose through the 1780s, the crowd at the Café de Procope changed with it. The philosophers and playwrights of earlier decades gave way to a new, far more dangerous set of regulars. Marat, Robespierre, Danton, Hébert, and Desmoulins. These men's names would soon be inseparable from the bloodiest chapters of the French Revolution. They all debated the burning political questions of the day over coffee and stronger drinks at its tables. A young, unknown artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte was reportedly there too. At the time he was simply a poor soldier seeking his next commission. He passed his idle hours playing chess, a favorite pastime of Parisian coffeehouse patrons. One frequently repeated story claims that Procope himself, the café's proprietor, once had to hold young Bonaparte's hat as collateral. The future emperor scrambled to find enough money to pay off his coffee bill, a wonderfully absurd image whether or not it happened exactly as told. But the most dramatic moment in the story of French coffeehouses didn't happen at Procope's tables at all. It happened a short walk away at the Café de Foy, inside the arcades of the Palais Royal. The table that started a revolution. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 12, 1789, the Palais Royal was packed with restless, agitated crowds. The political temperature in Paris had reached a boiling point. A British visitor touring the city that same summer described the extraordinary scenes unfolding in the coffeehouses of the district. Crowds packed inside, spilling out into the doorways and windows. They listened intently to speaker after speaker climbing onto chairs and tables to deliver furious, impassioned speeches against the government. Each time, thunderous applause met whichever line landed with the most vehemence. It was in this atmosphere that a young, relatively unknown journalist named Camille Desmoulins walked out of the Café de Foy, climbed onto a table and began to speak. What exactly he said has been recounted in various forms over the years. But the effect was unmistakable and immediate. Desmoulins worked the crowd into a fever pitch. By the time he finished, he and a growing mob of followers marched away from the café and out into the streets of Paris. It was the opening act of what would become the French Revolution. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. Read that sequence again slowly. It's worth letting it sink in. A journalist stood on a café table. He gave a speech fueled by the same drink that Ottoman sultans had once punished with death by drowning. 48 hours later, the most infamous prison in France had been stormed by a revolutionary mob. The very drink that rulers across 3 continents had spent over 2 centuries trying to ban, precisely because it made people think too clearly and talk too freely, had just helped ignite one of the largest political upheavals in human history. The pattern completed. Look back across everything we've covered so far. In Mecca, coffeehouses were shut down because officials feared what happened when ordinary people gathered to talk. In Constantinople, the punishment for a second offense was death by drowning, specifically because coffee sharpened minds rather than dulling them with drink. In London, a king tried to ban coffeehouses outright and folded within 11 days under public pressure. In Paris, a speech delivered feet away from a coffeehouse table helped trigger a revolution that would reshape the entire Western world. Every single ruler who tried to suppress coffee, across every century and every empire we've examined, was afraid of the exact same thing. Clear-headed people gathered together, talking freely. And every single one of them failed to stop it. Coffee earned its reputation as the rebel's drink honestly. It didn't inspire rebellion because of anything mystical in the bean. It inspired rebellion simply by keeping people awake, alert, and talking to one another. That was exactly what threatened power the most, at a moment in history when clear, connected minds were dangerous to those in charge. In the next chapter, we're going to step back from the coffeehouses of London and Paris. We'll travel to the place where all of this history actually began on the trade route level. The legendary port city of Mocha, the Arabian city that gave coffee its very name, and whose rise and eventual fall shaped the entire global coffee trade for centuries to come.